Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, everybody, and welcome to another Art of Procurement interview. And I've got two guests on the show today. One is actually a returning guest, and one is with us for the first time. And today I'm joined by Alun Rafique and Anya McKenna. So regular listeners, you may recall that Alun was previously on the show all the way back in episode 18 when he and his Market Dojo co-founder, Nick Drew, they answered a bunch of questions that I'd posed in an attempt to convince me of the merits of using e-auctions. And Anya, she is Market Dojo's employee number one. She spends a lot of her time talking to prospects and clients of Market Dojo, educating them on how to get the most out of an e-auction. So that's going to be the topic for today. We're going to go one step further on our first conversation, and we're going to deep dive on the critical success factors in making a e-auction go as planned and get the results that you want from it. We're going to break it down into three different areas. First, we'll talk event preparation. Then we'll move on to executing the event, and then we'll go into the activities that you need to perform after the event has closed. Before we go into the show, I do want to remind you that there's less than a week now to go to enter to win a category-specific market intelligence report, which is graciously being provided by the team at Denali Group. So if you manage a spend category, or if you're involved in sourcing, then you're not going to want to miss out on this. The winner's going to get to choose from a market intelligence report. You'll have a choice of over 25 different categories. So there's sure to be a category there that is aligned with something that you're doing or something that one of your peers is working on. So for more information, to find out how you can get a chance to win that report, go to artofprocurement.com/Denali report. That's artofprocurement.com/Denali report. Full terms are on that page. I'll also put a link to it in the show notes of today's episode. So go to that URL, you'll find out how you can enter and also how you can increase the chances to win. Okay then, well, let's go straight into the interview with Alun and with Anya. Hi there, and welcome to another episode of The Art of Procurement. And I'm really lucky to be joined by today's guests, Alun Rafique and Anya McKenna of Market Dojo. So, Alun and Anya, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much.
Hi, Phil. Thank you.
Well, Alun, for you, it's the second time on the show. I think the first time back in episode 18 it was. We had a discussion about the role that e-auctions can play as part of your sourcing toolkit. I was pretty skeptical, and I think that yourself and your co-founder Nick Drew did a great job in really helping me understand where and when we can use e-auctions. So we wanted to go a little bit deeper today and bring in Anya to the conversation as well. So Anya, I believe that you were employee number one for Market Dojo.
I was indeed, employee number one, brought in March, at the very beginning of March, before the eWorld conference. Since joining, we've developed another product, and we've expanded rapidly. We're just growing so quickly, it's insane.
I think Anya had a baptism of fire. As soon as she started the next day, it was literally in a conference in eWorld, so up at like 4 o'clock in the morning and talking about e-auctions at the event. So yeah, she's done very well. Prior
to which I didn't know what an e-auction was, so It was fast learning, and I think we got back at about 10 p.m. that night. I wear contact lenses and my eyes had dried up, and I thought, wow, this is going to be fun.
Well, what I wanted to do today was talk a little bit more about some of the kind of key steps necessary to execute on a successful e-auction. So on the first show, we talked a lot about the fact that where and when we can use e-auctions. Now it's how do we use them? How can we be most effective in using e-auctions? For listeners who didn't have the opportunity to listen in the first time to our first conversation, I just wondered if you could give a really brief overview of what an e-auction really is.
In terms of what an auction is, auction is just a tool to negotiate, and if you're looking at an e-tendering process, you don't necessarily, and you wouldn't normally start out with I'm going to run an e-auction. You put in the research to the category, you might go out there and get a few bids, etc., before you then decide to go to an e-auction. And an e-auction would be simply a replacement to doing a different kind of negotiation. So you might do your initial activity, and you might decide, actually I'm going to do a face-to-face negotiation, or actually I'm going to just do a phone call, or I might do an e-auction. And an e-auction is simply where the suppliers, if it's a reverse e-auction, bid to supply you with goods or services over time, and the price goes down, and at the end of it, hopefully you've got a supplier or suppliers that you're able to move forward with for a large negotiation or a contract. And otherwise you might do a forward auction if you're selling scrap, or like eBay kind of esque style where you're looking to sell items.
I think a lot of people build auctions up to be something more complicated than they actually are, when in fact it's just a negotiation, and that's what people need to remember.
Yeah, I think that's probably true, that when you think about an auction, you think of it as being something that's pretty complex and something that's really time consuming, but it is just another way of negotiating with another party. Yeah,
exactly.
Well, when it comes to a successful event then, and this is really what I wanted to cover in the show today, kind of some tips, some guidance for somebody who's about to launch or thinking about launching an e-auction. Where do you start? When you think of preparation for an event, what are some of the things that you need to really get right for the event to even be a success, to have any chance of being a success?
Quite funny. We actually recently put a guide together on this, a beginner's guide to reverse auctions, which kind of highlights all the important steps needed to create an auction.
Yeah, and so you essentially will start with your category selection. As I mentioned before, you don't necessarily just start any tender process with a view to I'm going to do an e-auction, and there are certainly you might ask kind of what products or services are suited, or what category you do, and I think there's the products or services that people see you're able to do an e-auction with, or the popular conception is that you can do those, but then there is what ones can you actually do an event on. So you've got the obvious categories out there, or commodities such as office supplies, for example. Everyone goes, okay, we can do that as an e-auction. But when you start talking about other products or services, depending on the complexity and the stakeholder side of it, the view might be it's too complex for an e-auction. And so it depends how you ask me the question. If you're going to ask me what's suitable for an auction, I'd say, well, there's the products or services that are perceived easy to do for an auction. There's products and categories you can actually do during an auction, and we've had people do auctions on jet engines, on detailed aerospace parts, management consulting, as well as all the commodities. However, some of them will give you more challenges with internal stakeholders than others. But in reality, anything that moves towards a negotiation, an e-auction could be possible for that. And the whole process, which starts off with around category selection, is to, in the simplest form, has something got good definition? Is there supplier liquidity? And when I say supplier liquidity, suppliers who are willing to bid, and can you define the specifications, whether it's a widget or a service? And if you can answer those two questions, then an auction could be possible.
So you tick the box on those three areas. I'm sure when you go out to your suppliers and say, hey, we're considering doing an e-auction, or we are doing an e-auction, their hearts probably sink. How do you bring credibility to the event? How do you ensure that your suppliers are actually going to participate, or encourage them to participate?
That's a really interesting question. And I think if you look at the last 20 years, when e-auctions have moved from the consultancy-esque at £250,000 a pop through to kind of what we do and kind of commoditizing it, I think there was an element of that change where with people putting tools in the hands of the actual end users, to be assisted by consultants, etc. So, but during that process, I think there was a challenge when a lot of auctions were done maybe not as well as they could have done, which has kind of tainted their reputation, which means that some suppliers look at it with this kind of a bit of fear and trepidation. I think it depends how you approach it. If you approach it in a professional manner, in the auction, due to the transparency and rigor involved in the upfront work, can actually, and there's some work done by the University of West of England, which is accessible on our site actually, around it actually helps strengthen the relationships, because unlike an RFQ, for example, when you might not put the effort in and do a face-to-face negotiation, you're actually kind of arguing about a lot of different things at the same time. With an auction, you tend to be focused on, it doesn't have to be just the price obviously, but it's you're defining what it is, and I think sometimes the benefits of an e-auction are also their Achilles heel, and what I mean by that is, if you run an RFQ, you get some bids back, suppliers don't get any feedback. They don't even know if they've won or lost. Well, they know if they've won, but they don't know if they've lost. With an e-auction, you actually get that feedback, and sometimes that can impact negatively to the view of the supplier on the process, but in fact, if they look back on it, they actually get a lot more market feedback and knowledge than they would if they didn't do it. And I think generally suppliers, when they start thinking about getting involved and more, realize that the sales cost is lower, you get more market feedback, you get the interaction, and if the auctions run well with the view towards the end of it being a buyer's choice or talking about the fluffy stuff afterwards, suppliers can still have that human relationship. So I think you're right, there's a general reticence maybe of the first time. However, as they move forward, they generally will find that they get a lot out of it.
So is it important for you to really help the supplier kind of along the way of the process, rather than just throwing out and saying, hey, you're going to participate in any auction? How much of a role does that play in it being a successful event?
Oh, completely. I mean, we have had examples where someone's contacted us and said they want to run an auction, and then they've gone away on holiday and left the auction to kind of fend for itself.
Yikes.
And they got like 300k worth of savings, which was really fortunate, but we really don't recommend that. But yeah, I think it is important to keep that relationship and that interaction with suppliers, and once you've sent out that invitation, to give them a call, make sure they're okay, they've understood the requirement, they know how to get logged in, they know how the qualification bids work, which are the bids that are placed prior to the auction, and just make sure they're okay, and be there, be kind of available to answer any questions throughout the duration of the auction. And yeah, that's really important, not to use that human element, not to lose it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's in the auctions, not an excuse not to pick up the phone. You definitely should speak to the suppliers once you go ahead with the process. I mean, what we've found with and what we've tried to do with how we work our software, and I think this is where a lot of software is going, is it used to be that you had to train the suppliers for e-auctions to make sure they're successful, but now what we've put in place is, because a lot of suppliers are used to eBay, used to Amazon, they're used to logging into SaaS products, what we've got within the software is that people can log in, they can, as Anya mentioned, they can be tracked, you can see if they've put qualification bids in, so before you even got to an auction, you're reasonably happy that it's going to be a success. So it's important to communicate with suppliers and handhold them, but nowadays you don't need to do as much of that as you would in the past, but you certainly want to, for the first auctions, let them know what's going on.
Right. Anya, I think you mentioned qualifying bids. So do you recommend that you collect a stake in the ground bid before you even go to an e-auction, rather than just going blind into the auction and kind of it being open season, for the want of a better word, in terms of bids that come into the tool?
Yeah, definitely. So the qualification bid is bids that are collected prior to the auction actually taking place. Effectively, an RFQ prior to the auction. So suppliers can log in advance and place their bids, and the supplier sort of has an idea of where they're sitting. It gives them an opportunity to make sure that the suppliers have understood the requirements and they haven't placed bids that are kind of miles out of what they should be. And it gives an opportunity for the suppliers to kind of test the tool as well and make sure they understand how it works.
Do the suppliers see the qualifying bids of the other participants, or is that at this point they don't see that level of transparency? They only see what they themselves put into the tool?
Yeah, the latter. They only see what they've entered, exactly.
And do you find that a lot of suppliers go in there with kind of crazy bids because they just want to put a stake in the ground to participate, but they don't want to give anything up yet? Or are companies being relatively realistic in terms of their first bids?
Well, we've got something in a tool which has a qualification price, so they can't put ridiculous bids in if the host doesn't want to. I mean, and we shouldn't underestimate the importance of qualifying bids. Qualifying bids let you know that, as I mentioned, that they can log in, they can register the user system, they can place a bid. So even before you get to an auction, you know that they're okay. But also, what qualification bids do is they let you know: have you got initial savings? Have the suppliers understood the specifications? Have you got the strategy right for the lotting? Have you made any mistakes on what you're asking for, which will be apparent in kind of spurious bids? So the qualification bids are so important with respect to if you're going to run a self-service auction and do it yourself. They just give you the confidence, but before you even get to the auction, you're actually pretty sure it's going to be a success or not, in which case you might pull the plug.
And when it comes, so you have your, you have the auction ready to go, you have the suppliers involved, you've communicated with them. I think that the one thing that's left is the actual strategy of the day and the way that the event is structured. And I think that from my personal perspective, that's where I always got a little bit confused, or where I didn't invest the time in understanding e-auctions probably as much as I could have done, was that all this seemed like really complex. I know you said earlier, it's essentially just another way of negotiating, using technology, and perhaps we make it more complex than it needs to be. So how important is the way that you structure the event, the lotting or the timing? The rules that you put in place, are those really key to the success of an event, or are those just kind of ways to tinker with essentially what the basic is just driving a negotiation?
No, I mean, it's massively important, but I think the point to, even though you've got a number of variations, it's not rocket science.
Right.
So, I mean, if I give you some examples, you've got like a ranked event. This is where your suppliers are position is based on their price or total cost, and they're given a rank, and suppliers see each other's will see their ranking compared to other suppliers, and they bid again. You could run an auction like that if, for example, you have a number of suppliers who are going to be around the similar price, and you get a momentum of social interaction, and it's that interaction between suppliers that gets you a better price within the market price. And at the end of an auction like that, you're probably going to have, let's say you've got 10 people in auction, you're probably going to have half of them around the same price, and that is the market price. You might have one who's incredibly low, who might have still have misunderstood, but hopefully you'll avoid them on the qualification process. You might have one really high because for whatever reason, and so if you might award to not necessarily the first place, that's a perfect auction. And if I know you're going to award to the winning supplier, then you can run an open auction, which is where you can only bid if you beat the lead bid. It doesn't give you the options, but if you're only going to award to the lowest price, then you don't necessarily matter. Or, for example, if you don't have the interaction in an auction, you might have a polyopoly or a monopoly, and you don't quite know how it's going to work. You can run something called a Japanese auction where they don't get the interaction, so the bid just decreases over time, and the suppliers accept or decline. And there's a great case study we've got on our website from HomeServe, who negotiated with 200 suppliers across 364 postcodes in the UK by dividing into 11 regions and 11 lots. And they did that in half an hour and saved a few million. And it does come down to the lotting structure. And the lotting structure is not just about within these more complex tools that you can do more and more things, but doesn't mean necessarily you should. So, for example, if someone's doing an office supplies tender, even though with our software now you can create hundreds of line items, we still say, actually, why don't you create just a basket lot of the core items, get them to auction the price for that, and upload a spreadsheet with the detail. Now you could say, well, you could get all the detail in the tool, but you've got to look at it from perspective what's easier for you and the suppliers. And so it's not necessary make it as complex as possible. You just need to make it practical.
You said an important thing there. It doesn't have to be complex. It's as complex as it needs to be based on what you're buying, but don't use all the bells and whistles that the tool allows you to, just to create something which looks like a fabulous event on the outside, but ends up being far too complex for anyone to really understand and interact with.
I think that's really, really important, and I think a lot of people want to do these auction, look at it very kind of complex. Do you know the easiest question when someone says how do we set up the event? What we'd normally go is, well, how would you do it outside of any auction?
Mm-hmm.
They kind of go, well, I can't possibly do this during the auction because it's that. It's like, well, how would you do it otherwise? And then they go, well, we'd probably do this, and this. It's like, well, that's how you structure the auction. The people, as Anya mentioned before, they shouldn't see it as a special magic event. It's just a negotiation, and you negotiation just like as you would on a face-to-face.
Yeah.
And the more simple it is, the more simple you create it, the more easy it's going to be for your suppliers to take part, and the more willing and likely they are to get involved.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. The more complex you make it, the more it's going to turn suppliers off from even participating, because they're going to need to spend more time to understand what they're even bidding on.
Exactly, and I think you have to kind of put yourself in the position of the supplier and imagine what they're going to think coming into it, and they'll probably only use these tools maybe once.
Right.
They don't want to have to learn a whole new system to use once and then go away again. So yeah, just keep it simple, really.
So how much of an impact does timing have of the event? Is there kind of a sweet spot of timing, or does it really not matter that much?
That's a good question, and we have the answer for you because we did an infographic recently.
Okay.
Again, it's on our website, but it tied all our clients' events. What's the average savings in our e-auctions run on our platform is about 23%, and on a ranked event, I'm not by any way suggesting that everyone's going to get 23%. And however, we looked at the differences on the savings from people who ran an auction for with an initial setting of 10 minutes or I think it was 15 minutes, half an hour, an hour. And what was interesting, that the percentages from the ones that finished on those three different timings were different. However, if you put in an auto extension, or what we call a dynamic close, in other words, if a bid's placed in the last minute, it gets extended. I'm sure anyone listening to this would probably know sniping on eBay, where you suddenly the last second you lose, and it's like, I had no chance. Yeah, we've all been there, and it's like, you got no chance to interact or react to what happened. And if you have an auto extension in the auction, what we found, and it was really interesting, was it didn't matter what the initial setting was for an auction, as long as you put the dynamic close in there, we found that the actual savings, irrespective of how long it was initially set for, after the auto extension went, all the kind of average savings was about the same, irrespective of the initial setting for the event. So I think the key part about it is, keep it short. However, make sure you have this dynamic close or auto extension, whatever you'd like to call it.
Yeah, so kind of the quicker you get into that auto extension, the quicker you're going to get to essentially what the market price is.
Yeah, precisely. And I know there's lots of extra little things you can put into an auction, and in the end, does it make a difference to result? It depends on your viewpoint. It's very hard to do a sliding doors moment. I mean, with our dynamic close, for instance, on our tool, you can reduce it as time goes on to speed things up. And I know there's little features in other tools, but I think as long as you set it up with a reasonable time length and auto extension, there's all these little things you can use to maybe speed things up, slow things down, or whatever. But would it actually affect the final result? I'm not so sure, and I think that's just where a common person using the system, as opposed to like maybe a consultant using the system, they can still achieve the success by just using some sensible criteria for it.
I think as long as you give the suppliers time to react, they will, and they'll be able to take part. And the dynamic close is a really good kind of tool in enabling that.
So let's move into event execution then. And I guess my first question is, when the event starts, is everything kind of in a black box to the supplier, or is there communication that goes on behind the scenes? Or do you even recommend there be any communication behind the scenes between either the people who are running it, if it's a third party, or you, if you're the buyer, and the sellers?
I mean, from our side, we when we started up 5 years ago, we obviously focused, as the listeners might know, just in e-auctions, and we've had a lot of developments in our talks with a lot of people run auctions in our tool, a lot of consultancies who've needed the kind of ability to interact with the tool. And being a self-service tool as well, available to anyone to just run an auction today, we have to have a lot of intelligence within the tool. And we take, it comes back to actual auctions not that tough. Once it's going, as Anya mentioned, we've had people who actually forgot the auctions on and let it run. We wouldn't recommend it. And I think the tool, first of all, the tool needs to be robust to allow that to happen. Second of all, I think the tool needs to be robust, so it doesn't matter what you change, really. It shouldn't cause the auction to fall over. I mean, when the auction starts, is it a black box? I mean, it depends how you've kind of set it up. When it starts, the supplier will see their rank if it's a ranked auction based on their pre-bids, and it would be their option on where to go from there.
And what do you do if nothing happens? What do you do if no one bids? Or has that ever happened when no one's bid?
That it's a really interesting question. It has happened to me actually when I was running a consultancy project when we were running a ranked auction. It was an office supplies. We had 3 initial bids which were very far apart, so there wasn't any interaction. And our recommendation was actually to involve, before you went to an auction, to involve more suppliers, because we knew that bids being far apart in a ranked event, you're not going to get the interaction, and you're probably not going to get the movement, and the client's not going to get the result that they wanted. And the auction ran and no one moved, and it was a bit upsetting. So I think the main point to say on that is, before you get to an auction, you've mitigated that risk. And I think that's the key thing. So I guess it's how do you avoid it? Don't get in that position in the first place, which might sound a bit obvious, but through careful preparation, that's entirely possible. However, you might end up in that situation, in which case I'd probably say we do have auctions where you don't get much interaction at the beginning, but in the last 5 minutes, that's when the interaction starts. If in the end you've done all the preparation, you've done all that, and you've ended up with an auction where no one's moved, then I think it's back to the drawing board and trying to understand what mistakes were made, if any, that have ended you in that position. I mean, for example, you might have thought, well, if I'm not going to get the interaction, I'm not actually going to run a ranked event. I'm going to run a Japanese event where suppliers don't see what other suppliers are, and so if no one moves during the auction, no one's none the wiser, and you haven't lost any face. So, and you might, before an auction start, decide to do that way, so you avoid the issue.
It's back to the 5 Ps, isn't it? Prior planning prevents poor performance. Oh, that was a mouthful. Struggled with that one.
That's your tongue twister for the day.
Yeah, exactly. And back to your question before, how much kind of involvement do you need to have with the suppliers? And if you've had that involvement with them, then hopefully you should see
mitigates that risk.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah.
I just have a couple of other questions regarding the event itself, and the first one is, what can you look for to ensure that suppliers are acting appropriately, or are there cases where you see that suppliers might not be operating kind of in line with what the tool has been set up or the auction has been set up to do? Are there any red flags that you look for, essentially?
It's a good question, and to be honest, we get asked that from suppliers and buyers alike about how do we know everyone's acting appropriately. I mean, first of all, acting inappropriately, it's in the UK, it's illegal, it's shilling. You shouldn't do it. And if we found out about it, we'd immediately intervene. Not that we've had to. What we find, I think, in general, people look at it with respect to kind of a normal negotiation. Anyhow, I mean, what to look for? I mean, if you see, I got asked the other day about, within our software, because it's self-service, there's no, when people run an auction, they have to be able to do it their own. We have the ability for people to delete spurious bids, for example, that on Proxy bid for a supplier, and if they do that, there's a big P and they get an email, so you can't bid on behalf of the supplier without the supplier knowing. And those kind of processes are very important, and you should have written permission from the supplier to be able to do that. But I got asked the question the other day, what about if a supplier bid really low to find out what's going on, then asked the bid to be deleted so they could see their rank and where the lowest bid was, and then started bidding again? And I thought, well, that's it's a fair question. What if a supplier did that? We've not actually have it happen, and within our software, I'm sure other software as well, obviously we're not the only provider, you have the ability to reject suppliers from events. I mean, you should have a knowledge of the cost from previous exercises, or you should have a kind of a should cost exercise. So if you can see a supplier bidding abnormally, which is probably to obtain some market feedback without any true bidding in there, then you'd bar them for the auction. And I think it's very careful to have in your terms and conditions, that all these bids are legally binding for X number of months. I mean, ultimately, if you have someone in there who wants to act inappropriately, you can't really stop that initial act. But if you can pick up on it from that, then you reject them out of the event.
Yeah, and have that up front in the rules and the communications of the event, so that folks know that that's basically what will happen if they do act inappropriately during the event.
Yeah, absolutely. The rules are important in the initial documentation. They're viewable to the suppliers. And, it does come up as a question, relatively often, but we've never actually had, or that I'm aware of, that kind of issue, speaking to the clients.
What about technical problems? So have you had auctions where there's been technical issues that a supplier has had? For example, they claim they can't make bids, or where the system hasn't done as what it should do. How do you deal with things? Do you restart the bid, or do you start entering proxy bids on behalf of suppliers who say they can't use the technology? How can somebody react if they start to have difficulties from the technical side of things while the event is actually being played out?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the ability to proxy bid is there, so they could get in touch with the host of the event, the buyer, and say, "You're having some problems, would you mind proxy bidding on my behalf?" If it's a problem, or they could bid from their mobile phones, which we've seen done in the past.
Right.
We've had taxi drivers bidding from mobile phones while they were stationary and parked, of course, and participate in that way. If it's an issue that the host is having with the event, if they're having technical problems, they can pause the auction, and that will automatically notify all the suppliers to say this event has been paused.
Okay.
So we've got a message board in the tool that's visible to everyone, and the host can send messages to individual suppliers or to all suppliers as a group, and vice versa. The suppliers can message the host. If they did encounter a problem, they can just hit the pause button and just wait until it's been resolved.
So let's finally go into, you've run the event is closed, you have a clear winner. What's really important, or what are the most important things to consider when you look at awarding the business? Both for the participants that have been awarded, but those that haven't as well.
Yeah, I think you need to, again, it's you to approach it in a professional manner. So you need to let the people who have won, that they've won, and people that have lost, thank them for bidding, because you might be running the event again or involved in other events. So treating everyone very professionally is key. Who do you award it to? Well, that should be an easy decision, because it should be based on rules that you set before that you've even gone to an auction. So the suppliers know, hey, it's the lowest price going to win, or they might realise it's a buyer's choice basis, but the first price is looked on the most favourably, or it might be you're negotiating the core element, and then you're going to bring the top 3 suppliers in to talk about the non-price elements and the kind of fluffy stuff, or the service level agreements, or what about the tail end of the spend. So I think it's, the award is actually based on just simply what you've decided beforehand. What are we going to do? And so it should be just the process moving forward. I think it's just important to communicate to the suppliers and make sure they all are aware of what's going on, and not run the auction with respect to, bosh, there you go, ignore the rest, just look at the winner. I think you need to treat everyone with respect there.
Do you find that the notion of the buyer's choice award, so not necessarily the lowest price, but the price obviously plays one part in a number of considerations, if the lowest price supplier doesn't win, does that turn them off from participating in the future?
Yeah, it's a very valid point. I mean, a lot of auctions are run on the buyer's choice because it gives actually suppliers confidence that you're going to or may take account of other things, and you're also protecting yourself as well, because a supplier might bid far below their means, and you wouldn't want to award it to a supplier which might put themselves out of business.
Right.
So I think that's careful. However, you're absolutely right. If you're always awarding best still to the incumbent, or you're not awarding to the lowest price, then as time moves forward, if it's an activity which you engage in quite a lot, suppliers will be turned off partaking in the auction, and that's a very important consideration that you need to look at. And if you're continually awarding to your incumbents or not the lowest price, then you will find suppliers will be like, hey, I've won 5 auctions, why haven't I been awarded the business? And that comes down to the preparation, letting the suppliers know, is there a switching cost they need to counter during their bidding, for example. And you hit the nail on the head, and that's some of the reasons sometimes that people get turned off the auctions, because of such things such as that.
So how do you maintain credibility then when you start thinking about doing these auctions over time, and you can have one event and you award it to the non-lowest price bidder for a number of reasons that is the right business decision. You do that continually over time, or you continue to award the business just the incumbent. It kind of takes away the credibility, and I'm sure that knowledge gets out into the marketplace. How are companies managing against that or mitigating that risk?
I think the simple answer to that, at the beginning of this, I said there are 2 things you need to really make the auction a success: definition, liquidity. Yeah. And liquidity is defined as not just suppliers who can bid, but suppliers who are willing to bid. Now, I think you can extend that. Liquidity is not just about suppliers who can bid and willing bid, but suppliers who can bid, willing to bid, and you're willing to award them the business. Yeah. I think to approach the auction in a professional manner, any supplier involved in the auction shouldn't be there just to hammer down the incumbent. Right. They should be there because you're saying that they're actually possible suppliers. I mean, we have had situations for some clients I know where they've negotiated huge amounts off the incumbent, but they've had better bids from other suppliers, and they've wanted procurement, funny enough, has wanted to go with the other suppliers, but the stakeholders are the ones who've kind of driven them back towards the incumbent. And I think with the strength of procurement in an organisation, and with cost becoming a very, very important consideration in today's business, then perhaps procurement will get a bigger kind of ability to kind of make that decision to maybe not go with the incumbent. I think if you keep on awarding to the incumbent, you're on a hiding to nothing in the long run. Yeah.
So I know that we're coming against time, and I have a final question. We've covered kind of the key tips that we can take that are necessary to execute successful auctions, covering preparation, covering the event itself, and then the award post-event. And when you take all that into account, I'm interested for both you, Alun and Anya. What's the single most critical success factor, do you think? If there's one thing that a listener should take away to ensure that the next event that they run is a success?
I'd say preparation is key.
Yeah.
We've got a little graphic showing the time it takes to complete an event through our tool, and the time it takes to run a tender out with the tool, and it's got different stages from preparation, negotiation, and the kind of after part of it. And the preparation time for an auction takes longer than it would if you just ran the tender via email, and the negotiation time is sped up so much that it quickens the entire duration of the process. But really kind of spend the time making sure your specs completely accurate, all your suppliers are involved and understand what's going on prior to the event even happening. So yeah, preparation is key. Okay. That's what I'd say.
From my side, I'd say that I'd agree completely with what Anya says. I think you've got to look at the auction activity with a view to there is a bit, as Anya mentioned, there's a bit of extra work, but there's a higher gain. You need someone to take a proactive approach that they can put a bit more work into it for more success. We've got a marketing campaign at the moment about be the e-sourcing hero, because in organizations, for people to take on a new kind of activity, you need to put that proactivity in around the preparation. You need that person to want to make a difference. I think that's really key.
No, that definitely makes sense, that it's not an e-auction isn't a quick way of just getting some savings without putting much effort into it. There's just the effort is in different places in the process. On that question then, we're coming to the end, and I'm interested to know that if listeners would like to reach out to you just to learn a little bit more about the topic of e-auctions, or to understand kind of what you're doing at Market Dojo, where would the best place be for them to reach out to you?
Yeah, I mean, we're very approachable. I hope we are. Just www.marketdojo.com. We've got a contact page. Email us, use live chat, send us an email. And we've got lots of resources on our website, which are all free. You just have to sign up and register. We've got a great YouTube channel, and we love engaging. I mean, our heart is this is where we started. Yeah. And so welcome the debates. Really,
we're all on LinkedIn, and we've got a great Facebook group there, or LinkedIn group there as well, on our company page. So we regularly post stuff there. So yeah, get involved in the discussions.
Okay, great. Well, Anya, Alun, thank you very much for your time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to link up to some of the things that we talked about in the show. Those will all be at artofprocurement.com/auction tips. That's artofprocurement.com/auction tips. I'll link to some of the documents that we talked about. I'll link up to Alun and Anya's contact details so you can get out in touch. And, thank you for your time today. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks, Phil. It's been really great to chat.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.